The morning sun cast golden reflections across the glass facade of Sterling Corporate Tower, where 30 floors of American ambition reached toward the Chicago skyline. On the 28th floor, Regional Manager Brad Coleman paced his corner, office like a caged predator, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. Today wasn't just any day. Li Wei-jiang, the Chinese billionaire behind Dragon Industries, was visiting to finalize a deal worth $200 million. Coleman had spent weeks preparing, memorizing Jiang's company portfolio and downloading language apps, though his Mandarin remained limited to hello and thank you. Remember, everyone, Coleman announced to his assembled staff, his voice carrying the authority of someone drunk on his own importance. Mr. Jiang expects perfection. No mistakes, no interruptions, and certainly no embarrassment. His eyes swept the room, lingering dismissively on the support staff. That means you people stay invisible, clean, quiet, and out of the way. In the corner, James Washington continued emptying wastebaskets with quiet dignity. At 55, James had worked as a janitor at Sterling Corporate for 8 years, his presence so invisible to executives that they spoke around him as if he were furniture. His grey uniform marked him as part of the building's infrastructure, rather than its humanity. What none of them knew was that James Washington held degrees in international business and East Asian studies from Northwestern University. Before life's harsh realities forced him into janitorial work, his wife's medical bills, his daughter's college tuition, the recession that destroyed his consulting business, he had spent 3 years working in Shanghai and Beijing, developing business relationships and mastering Mandarin. Now he emptied trash cans and cleaned offices, while executives who couldn't order lunch in Mandarin prepared to negotiate with one of China's most successful businessmen. Mr. Coleman, his assistant Rebecca chirped nervously. Mr. Jiang's car just pulled up. Coleman straightened his tie for the 5th time, his palms damp with nervous perspiration. Remember, first impressions are everything. This deal could make or break the quarter. As the elevator chimed and the doors opened, Li Wei-jiang stepped into the hallway, like visiting royalty. 70 years old, but sharp as a blade. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of wealth and power. His dark eyes took in every detail of the office with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating investments and judging character. Mr. Jiang, welcome to Sterling Corporate, Coleman said with his most professional smile, extending his hand. I'm Brad Coleman, Regional Manager. Jiang shook his hand briefly, his expression neutral and unreadable. Then, without warning, he began speaking in rapid, fluent Mandarin. Coleman's smile froze on his face like a mask. The Mandarin flowed from Jiang's lips like a river, complex, nuanced, filled with business terminology that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics, to Coleman's untrained ears. The billionaire gestured toward the office layout, clearly asking questions about the company's operations, but Coleman stood paralyzed, understanding nothing. Coleman stammered, his face flushing red with embarrassment. Would it be possible to speak in English? Jiang continued in Mandarin, his tone suggesting mild surprise that a regional manager of an international corporation couldn't communicate in his language. He gestured again, this time toward the conference room, clearly expecting a response. Coleman's prepared presentation notes suddenly felt worthless. His carefully rehearsed talking points about market penetration and profit margins meant nothing if he couldn't understand the client's questions. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized the magnitude of his predicament. Mr. Jiang, I apologize, Coleman said desperately, his voice cracking slightly. I don't speak Mandarin fluently. Perhaps we could conduct our meeting in English. Jiang's eyebrows raised slightly, not in anger, but in what appeared to be disappointment. He said something else in Mandarin, his tone suggesting frustration with the communication barrier. Rebecca stepped forward helpfully. Mr. Coleman studied your company extensively. He's very knowledgeable about your business operations. Jiang responded in Mandarin again, and Coleman could only stand there helplessly, watching his career-defining opportunity slip away due to his inability to communicate with the most important client in the company's history. The other executives, in the room began shifting uncomfortably, recognizing that their regional manager, the man responsible for landing the biggest deal of the year, was completely out of his depth. Coleman's reputation for arrogance and competence was crumbling. In real time, perhaps, Coleman said with forced cheerfulness, we could use a translation service? Or maybe… Zhang shook his head, clearly disappointed. He said something in Mandarin that sounded like a polite but firm dismissal, then turned toward the elevator as if preparing to leave. Coleman's panic reached new heights. Wait, please, Mr. Zhang, we can work something out. This deal is too important. That's when James Washington stepped forward from the corner where he'd been quietly cleaning. Sir, James said respectfully, addressing Zhang directly, may I help translate? And then, to everyone's absolute shock, James began speaking perfect, fluent Mandarin. The effect was electric. Zhang's face lit up with genuine surprise and delight as James spoke, his pronunciation flawless, his tone respectful and culturally appropriate. Coleman's mouth fell open in stunned disbelief while the other executives stared as if they were witnessing magic. James and Zhang conversed easily in Mandarin, their body language relaxed and natural. Zhang gestured animatedly, clearly pleased to finally communicate with someone who understood both his language and the cultural nuances that came with it. After several minutes of conversation, James turned to Coleman, who was still standing, frozen in shock. Mr. Zhang was asking about the company's commitment to international partnerships and cultural understanding. James translated smoothly. He was concerned when he realized the regional manager couldn't communicate in Mandarin, as it suggested a lack of genuine interest in Chinese business culture. Coleman's voice came out as barely a whisper. You speak Chinese? Mandarin. Yes, sir, James replied with quiet dignity. I lived and worked in Shanghai and Beijing for 3 years before returning to the States. Zhang spoke again, and James nodded before translating. Mr. Zhang says he's impressed that Sterling Corporate employs someone with such cultural competency, even if that person isn't in a management position. The implied criticism hit Coleman like a slap. Here was a man he had dismissed as irrelevant, someone he ordered to stay invisible, who possessed exactly the skills needed to save the most important business deal of Coleman's career. Zhang continued speaking to James, occasionally gesturing toward Coleman and the other executives. James listened carefully, responding appropriately, conducting himself with a professionalism that made Coleman's earlier panic look childish by comparison. What's he saying now? Rebecca asked nervously. James hesitated, glancing at Coleman before responding. He's asking about the company's organizational structure and whether the person with the best cultural understanding is involved in strategic decision-making. Coleman felt his career flashing before his eyes. Tell him that we value all our employees' expertise, James translated faithfully, though Zhang's skeptical expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Coleman's sudden appreciation for employee diversity. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with James serving as a bridge between two worlds that Coleman had never bothered to understand. Zhang's demeanor grew increasingly warm toward James, while remaining coolly professional toward Coleman. Finally, Zhang said something that made James smile, the first genuine expression of pleasure Coleman had seen from the janitor in 8 years of working in the same building. Mr. Zhang has agreed to continue with the meeting, James announced. However, he's requested that I remain present to ensure clear communication and cultural understanding throughout the negotiations. The conference room meeting that followed was unlike anything Coleman had ever experienced. Instead of leading the discussion as he had planned, he found himself relegated to a supporting role while James facilitated communication between Zhang and the Sterling corporate team. James's knowledge extended far beyond language skills. He understood Chinese business customs, knew the cultural significance of Zhang's gestures and expressions, and could navigate the subtle diplomacy that international negotiations required. When Zhang asked complex questions about market analysis or regulatory compliance, James translated not just the words, but the cultural context behind them. In Chinese business culture, James explained to Coleman during a brief break, direct confrontation is considered disrespectful. When Mr. Zhang asks about potential challenges, he's actually expressing serious concerns about your company's preparedness for international partnerships. Coleman nodded mutely, finally understanding how much he didn't know about the client he'd been preparing to court for months. As the meeting progressed, Zhang's respect for James became increasingly obvious. The billionaire asked James about his background, his experience in China, his understanding of both cultures. James responded with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his knowledge through years of study and practical experience. Mr. Zhang is impressed with your employees' qualifications, James translated at one point. He's asking why someone with international business experience and fluent Mandarin is working in facilities management. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Coleman had no good answer because the truth was too embarrassing to admit. He had never bothered to learn anything about James Washington beyond his job title. Zhang spoke again, his tone becoming more serious. He's saying that in Chinese culture, wisdom is respected, regardless of a person's current position, James translated. He believes that companies succeed when they recognize and utilize all their employees' talents. Coleman felt smaller with each passing minute. His planned presentation about market dominance and corporate efficiency seemed hollow when delivered through a translator he had spent 8 years treating as invisible. By the meeting's end, Zhang had not only agreed to the partnership but had specifically requested that James be involved in all future communications between the companies. The billionaire spoke privately with James in Mandarin before leaving, their conversation animated and respectful. After Zhang's departure, the conference room fell into uncomfortable silence. Coleman's staff looked at him expectantly, waiting for his reaction to the dramatic reversal they had just witnessed. James, Coleman said finally, his voice hoarse with humiliation, I owe you an apology. I had no idea about your background, your qualifications. James began collecting the empty water glasses, his movements calm and dignified. You never asked, sir. The simple statement carried more weight than any angry accusation could have. For 8 years, Coleman had worked in the same building as James, had seen him every day, but had never once been curious enough to learn anything about the man behind the uniform. What did Mr. Zhang say to you at the end? Rebecca asked quietly. James paused in his cleaning. He offered me a position with Dragon Industries, Director of Cultural Relations for their American operations. The announcement hit the room like a thunderbolt. Coleman felt his stomach drop as he realized that his company was about to lose the one person who had made the Zhang partnership possible. What did you tell him? Coleman asked weakly. I told him I would consider it, James replied. I've been invisible here for 8 years. Perhaps it's time to work somewhere that values what I have to offer. Zhang's final words to the group, delivered through James's translation, echoed in Coleman's mind. A company that cannot see the value in its own employees cannot be trusted to see value in its partners. As James finished cleaning and prepared to leave, Coleman realized that his career at Sterling Corporate would never recover from this day. He had been exposed as incompetent, prejudiced, and blindly arrogant in front of the company's most important client. But more than his career, what haunted him was the recognition of his own character flaws. For years, he had judged people by their job titles, their uniforms, their race, and their perceived social status. He had dismissed James as irrelevant, while the man possessed exactly the skills and knowledge that Coleman lacked. James, Coleman called out as the janitor reached the conference room door. I'm sorry, not just for today, but for everything. For never seeing you as anything more than the help? James completed the sentence gently. Mr. Coleman, respect isn't something you give when it's convenient. It's something you show because every person has value, regardless of their current circumstances. With that, James Washington walked out of the conference room, leaving behind 8 years of invisibility and walking toward a future where his talents would finally be recognized and valued. 3 months later, James Washington sat in his new office at Dragon Industries, Chicago headquarters, serving as Director of Cultural Relations and earning 3 times his former janitor's salary. His first project had been establishing cultural competency requirements for all American employees working with Chinese partners. Brad Coleman had been quietly transferred to domestic operations, his international responsibilities reassigned to managers with actual cultural knowledge. Sterling Corporate had implemented mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all executives, using Coleman's failure as a case study in the cost of prejudice and assumptions. Li Wei Jiang had become not just James's employer, but his mentor, and their professional relationship had blossomed into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. The story of that transformational day had spread throughout Chicago's business community, becoming a powerful reminder that competence, wisdom, and value often came in unexpected packages. One evening, as James reviewed cultural briefings for Dragon Industries' next American acquisition, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. 8 years of emptying trash cans and being invisible had led to this opportunity, but only because he had maintained his dignity and continued learning even when the world seemed determined to overlook him. His mother's words echoed in his memory. "Knowledge is never wasted, son. Plant it deep, water it with patience, and someday it will bloom when you least expect it." She had been right. Respect, knowledge, and opportunity had finally found him. Not because he demanded them, but because he had remained ready when the right moment arrived. The lesson was simple but profound. True worth was never measured by titles, money, or appearances, but by knowledge, character, and the respect with which a person treated others, regardless of their current circumstances. True worth is not measured by titles, money, or appearances, but by knowledge, character, and respect. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. Drop a comment with your thoughts and tell us, what truth are you brave enough to speak today?